gang me again. I actually ran out of memory in my camera there. So back here, the Taiping Rebellion ends in failure. It's a rebellion, right? It went up against the powers that be and were pushed down not only by the Qing dynasty, but also by foreign troops that didn't want to see the weak Qing die. They wanted to deal with the weak Qing, right? Who kind of let the foreign powers do what they wanted to do, right? These laws of extraterritoriality, these special economic zones, etc. So there will be a second, actually rebellion. We call it a revolution, following the Taiping. This second rebellion will be by a group of nationalists, Chinese nationalists called the Boxers. Right? So what happens first? There was a Chinese ruler, a young emperor who believed in reform, goes for about 4 months, tries to make changes, tries to, in a sense, industrialize China. It doesn't go far enough, and he dies of mysterious causes. He's succeeded by his elderly, I think at that time she's quite old, aunt, Empress Dowager Cixi. So this woman comes to control China. She's very powerful, right? It's an absolutist rule. Her reforms, for example, trying to modernize the Chinese Navy, included making a big marble boat and putting it in her garden pond, okay? So very old school, advised by Confucian rulers, right? We have, again, these Confucian, these men who had gotten their positions through the metropolitan exams, studying essentially a curriculum that was like 2,400 years old, right? So early Confucianism. Maybe did not serve China so well as it moved through the late 19th century. Foreigners had different spheres of influence. We'll see on the map in a moment, but the French here, the British here, the Russians, the Japanese, the Americans, eventually even the Germans. I say even the Germans because they were a brand new nation, tried to control parts of the Chinese economy. So the next rebellion is actually going to be by Chinese nationalists. These were Chinese who wanted a China for themselves, right? China for the Chinese. Get the white devils, as they said, out. So this was a rebellion against Americans, American industrialists, American merchants, American missionaries. This was a great age of Protestant missionary work in China. The Jesuit Catholics had tried it, right, in the 16th and 17th centuries, and now the Protestants tried it. Frankly, not with a lot of luck either. So the rebellion against them, and we have, Americans being killed in China, and the Chinese government doing nothing. Well, doing worse than nothing, actually abetting and aiding this rebellion against foreigners. So the Americans sent in the troops. They had troops in East Asia. The French, the British, the Japanese do likewise, and the rebellion is crushed. And then the Chinese government is punished. Right? China has to pay. This weakens an already anachronistic, kind of outdated regime, and the Empress Dowager actually dies before this happens, I think in 1908. She dies before there's a real revolution, leaving a 3 or 4-year-old kid on the throne. If you want to see a really good movie because you're stuck at home, Netflix, The Last Emperor by Franco Zeffirelli. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. Now that I'm on video, I can't remember it. Franco Zeffirelli. Anyway, beautiful movie. It's quite dated at this point, but shows Puyi. He's like 4 years old, and he's running around the palace, and the Confucian scholars are chasing him. He's just a kid, and he's ruling China. Well, in reality, I mean, he had regents kind of governing for him, but nonetheless, he's overthrown. He doesn't get killed or anything. He kind of lives a long life. Actually used by the Japanese later, and lives under communism in his later years. But dynastic rule ends. China becomes a short-lived democracy. The democracy does not control China very well. We have what used to be called warlords controlling parts of China. Very confused situation as China moves into the 20th century. And things are not going to get better for most Chinese in the coming decades. There's going to be civil war. There's going to be Japanese invasion of World War II. There's going to be difficulties under the early communist regime, well into the 1980s, not just the early communist regime. So the China you see today, this strong, industrial, economic power, is only a recent creation or recreation, really, since probably the late 1980s. So what do we have? We have China, right? We have the British kind of controlling the Yangtze River Valley. They're also pushing in. They've already taken India. That'll be our next chapter. They're moving into Tibet, Burma. The French Interesting, because I think that's called Vietnam in the modern map, yes. French moving into their colony of French Indochine. The French and British kind of create Siam or Thailand to keep themselves apart so they don't come into conflict with one another. Hong Kong taken by the British, given back by 1990 actually. A separate status today, right? Japan moved through Korea, now into Manchuria. Well, that's why they've gone to war against Russia, really. So the Japanese moving, and in fact claiming Manchuria as a colony called Manchukuo in 1931. Where are the Americans? The Americans are all over the place as well. In fact, the Americans had issued a policy called the open door. Like, hey, let's not carve China up into separate colonies and plant the American flag here and the British flag here and the French flag. Let's not do to China what the Europeans are actually doing to the continent of Africa, right, carving it up. But let's instead just dominate, different parts of the economy, different regions, but kind of keep trade open to one another in China. So China is really prostrate. It's laying down. It's being taken advantage of by these foreign powers. Not only Europeans, but the Japanese are there too. Speaking of Japan, how did that happen? Well, Japan had long been a feudal, F-E-U-D-A-L nation. To oversimplify, as we do in these survey courses, Japan had been governed by landlords, right? Different parts of Japan by powerful landlords with their own private armies called knights. That's feudalism, right? Eventually, one of the landlords suppressed or conquered the rest of them. This would be the Tokugawa family. Tokugawas became the shoguns, which didn't mean king, it meant warlord. So the most powerful of the other lords. I can have the only army, you can't have armies, although the shoguns were often afraid of being assassinated by some of the powerful landlords. We saw in a previous chapter how when some of the daimyos, the landlords, converted to Christianity, that was a real threat to the shogun. Because not that he really cared what they believed, but the fact that they became Christian would mean there were ties to Europe, and Europe had guns. Even in the 17th and early 18th centuries, right? They had muskets. So the shogun persecuted Christianity in Japan, really as an effort to keep the Europeans out, except for the Dutch, right? The Dutch weren't really interested in converting anyone. The Dutch were pretty open with their Calvinism. The Dutch, sorry to stereotype everybody here, we do this in this course, but cared more about making money, right? So 2 Dutch ships were allowed in every year, mainly to bring guns to, me, the shogun, no pun intended, would get the weaponry and some books and some Dutch language. So we could keep down the rest of the daimyos. Okay, great, you're the warlord. You should be able to make war and defend Japan. Well, by 1853, that was not possible. In that year, the United States shows up, the United States Navy essentially with steam-powered sailboats, kind of aim their guns at the warlord who cannot defend Japan. This is not how it happened, but to remember things in history, sometimes you make the movie in your head. So I imagine the warlord's kind of standing there with his sword, even though they did have some Dutch muskets, standing there with a sword facing off against the American Navy, steam-powered vessels, and like, what can I do? Okay, I can't defend my people. No, you're fired. Who fires the warlord, the shogun? The emperor. The emperor's kind of sitting over here in a chair. Why doesn't he get involved? Well, the emperors have not gotten involved in politics because, look, that's a dirty business, right? The emperor of Japan was believed before 1945 to be a child of the sun, S-U-N, a child of the gods in the religion of Shintoism. And Japanese practice its national faith, although they could also be Buddhists at the same time, right? So the emperor had a spiritual role, but essentially pushes the shogun out of power. The young Meiji, do I have that word? Meiji emperor takes power, governs in his own name, and realizes Japan, a proud culture, had been humiliated by the West. The solution was to copy the West, to bring in American engineers and French military strategists and British naval engineers and German, factory architects, and to modernize Japan. Okay? So Japan does a quick 180. We saw those other 3 societies in this chapter, the Ottoman Empire, China, and Russia, in no particular order, kind of stagnating, slowing down politically, slowing down certainly industrially, not necessarily morally or ethically or artistically, but slowing down industrially and democratically for certain. Those were all autocratic regimes. Japan does a 180, at least in the terms of industrialization. They don't become democracy. There is some political liberalization, but they begin to build factories and railroads and banks and ships and ports and things like this with foreign help. Hey, I want a job. It's 1869 and I'm looking for work and I know how to build machines. I go to Japan for a couple years and teach them how to do it, and then they get rid of me. Right? Once the Japanese learn how to do this themselves, they get rid of the foreigners. They'd also sent kind of the best and brightest young Japanese male students abroad to Germany, France, Britain, the United States to learn the techniques of industrialization, to learn the techniques, especially of naval warfare. There are Japanese future admirals going to the British Naval Academy. So Japan does this really 180 after 1868. Power to the reforming young Meiji emperor who makes Japan a modern industrial nation, right? The economy's modernized. There we go, foreign experts coming in, Japanese students going abroad. The emperor will share a degree of power, still has most of it, but will share power with a parliament made up mainly of very wealthy industrialists. The former merchants now become the factory owners, right? And they benefit from government policy, so they now sit in or at least have a vote in the government. Parliament was called a diet, which might seem like an odd word for many of us. That was actually the Dutch word, some of the Dutch influence still for parliament. So there's a little bit of political liberalization, frankly not much. Certainly the poor peasants don't have any voice in government. In fact, they're going to be exploited, taxed very harshly. Like, how's Japan going to fund railroads and factories and shipping ports and things like this? With really harsh taxes on people who are already very poor. So it's a great sacrifice by the poor people of Japan to make it an industrialized nation rather quickly. The samurai also they lose power, are maybe unhappy in many ways, because the style of warfare is going to change. It's not this old samurai pride of Bushido, the code of the warrior, kind of, silk gowns and swords you might imagine, the ninjas, right? It's going to be grunts, crawling through the mud. So the samurai really lose their status in society. Many of them end up, frankly, living in the growing cities and going to kabuki theater and drinking a lot. I mean, to grossly stereotype. So Japan becomes a modern industrial economy and also imperialistic, right? It's going to take its gunships and go against Korea. 1895 takes over the peninsula. 10 years later defeats Russia, especially in the Battle of Tsushima we talked about previously, and then begin to make incursions in the northern China. And eventually by 1937, China proper. That's the start of World War II. So these things are going to have consequences to people sitting in Jamestown, maybe reading this in the paper, like, who cares what's happening way over on that side of the world? Well, World War II is coming, right, with the rise of Japanese power. And also this rivalry that will arise between the United States and Japan for control of the Pacific. So there we go. That is the lesson for chapter 31. Let me just click through here to make sure I didn't miss anything. These were just slides that I decided not to use. What I'm going to try to do, and I'm having a bit of trouble doing this, shifting, yes, okay, my screen just went blank. Okay, it's up again. I want to shift a bit of video. If I can't get this to work, I'm going to save anything. There, it looks like it looks like it's going to work. Okay, this comes from, it's on YouTube, CNN Millennium, MILLENNIUM, 19th Century, The Machine. We'll see how this works in this format. I mean, I'd normally show you this in class. It's only 8 minutes, so stick with us.
China began the 19th century still confident of her superiority over the rest of the world. Her population numbered 400 million. Her empire controlled the world's biggest economy. China enjoyed a favorable balance of trade with the West, receiving great quantities of money to pay for its service. Porcelain, 10,000 tons of tea each year. So much money poured into China that a Chinese trader became the richest man in the world. Hao Kwa, one of the few officially allowed to trade with foreigners. All foreign business was channeled through designated warehouses in what was then the world's largest city, Canton. But now, the age-old economic superiority of the East was under threat. Britain had found a product to reverse the balance of trade: opium, grown on the hillsides of newly conquered India. The British invested massively in the manufacture and distribution of the drug, trading it for China's tea. Opium was already eating away at China's social fabric. That damage was made worse by Britain's commercial muscle.
Poison, alas, has been allowed to creep in unchecked, till at last barbarian smoke fills the market.
The British shipped opium to the Chinese coast and up its rivers, penetrating almost every artery of the country. The stability of Chinese society was threatened. In 1839, the emperor appointed Lin Tse-su to stop the trade.
臣林则徐恭请圣安。林则徐，我派你为钦差大臣，到广州去查禁鸦片，事关国家安危，你一定要把这件大事办好。
Lin wrote to Queen Victoria.
Suppose there were people from another country who carried opium for sale to England and seduced your people into buying and smoking it. Certainly your honorable ruler would deeply hate it and be bitterly aroused.
Lin's appeal got nowhere. Instead, he tried to paralyze the trade.
所有外国商人应将自己所有鸦片全部缴关，以免巨价干切，以后来船再不敢夹带鸦片。如有带来，甘愿鸦片没收，人地正法。
He took 350 British merchants into custody and ordered them to deposit more than 20,000 chests of opium near the temple of the three Buddhas. Thousands of balls of compressed opium were taken away, thrown into trenches, mixed with lime, and flushed into the Pearl River Delta. The British would respect nothing except force. The ensuing war led China to defeat and Britain to shame. In the British Parliament, William Gladstone criticised the government.
A war more unjust in its origin. A war more calculated to cover this country with permanent disgrace. I do not.
The man who helped negotiate the terms of China's capitulation was Hao Kwa. He died a year later, a broken man in a shattered world. Held at gunpoint, the treaty negotiations were a one-sided game. Every Chinese move failed, celebrated as a national hero.